Buonasera a tutti. Good evening, everyone. Dear friends, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear students, welcome to this forum, Interreligious Forum, and welcome also to our guest, Father Francis Clooney. And today we have a special gift to listen to a renowned scholar on Hindu-Christian relationship. And a special thank also to Father Brian Lobo, the Dean of the Faculty of Missiology, who supported us in organizing this forum, and also for his contribution, for his close collaboration with the Center for Interreligious Studies. Today, so we will have the translation also in Italian, so it will be easier for all of you also to, for those who cannot speak fluently English, to have the translation into Italian, and also to follow some part of the speech, of the lecture of Father Francis through the paper we distributed to you all. Let me say a few things about just few things, because there are so many things to say about Father Professor Francis Clooney. He's a Jesuit priest, and he's the Parkman Professor at Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard University, at Harvard Divinity School in the United States. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago in 1984, he taught at Boston College for 21 years before coming to Harvard. From 2010 and 2017, he was the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. And his primary areas of Indological scholarship, and is the field of theology, theological commentarial writings in the Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of India. He's also a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning, deepened through the study of tradition other than one's own. Father Clooney, at the present, he got also his fifth honorary doctorate. He was awarded in September 2023 by the University of Scranton. During the period of 2022 and 2023, he was the president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Father Clooney is also the author of numerous articles and books. I just leave to my colleague Paolo Trianni to mention those books during his presentation. Let me say a few things about the forum today, the topic of the forum, today's forum. The theme is Reading Mystical Poetry Interreligiously, the case of Indo-Christian love for God in times of absence. The vernacular traditions of South Asia are very rich in religious literature that opens up possible interreligious learning beyond what the Sanskrit and the other classical traditions offer. In Tamil Nadu, there are important bodies of sacred text in Tamil poetry that is both mystical and lovely. So Father Clooney today will focus on poems that speak of God present, but also elusively absent, and then shows how such poetry offers fruitful opportunities for Catholic comparative theological learning. In the background, there is his book, whose title is His Hiding Place in Darkness, printed in 2013, and his current project of a new translation of the first four alvars. Father Clooney, thank you for being with us. Thank you very much. And now, Professor Ciani can...
Buonasera e benvenuti anche da parte mia. Per noi è veramente un onore avere qua con noi padre Francis Clooney, che, come ha detto il professor Bongiovanni, è un gesuita e insegna nella prestigiosa Università di Harvard e insegna teologia comparata. Questo, oltre al piacere di averlo qua, insomma l'onore di averlo qua, è il motivo per il quale lo abbiamo invitato insieme a padre Lobo e insieme a Bongiovanni, perché questa disciplina è abbastanza diffusa negli Stati Uniti, anche un po' nel nord Europa, ma in Italia la teologia comparata ancora non è arrivata. E quindi, come dire, interpretiamo un po' questa serata come il primo step, il primo passo per introdurre anche in Italia la teologia comparata. E che cos'è? Si può considerare una sorta di appendice della teologia delle religioni. Però prima di giudicare le dottrine di una religione, come dire, è corretto dal punto di vista etico, ma è anche un buon metodo quello di studiare a fondo le altre religioni, leggere i loro testi e conoscere anche le loro divinità. E quindi si fa un confronto in vista di portare avanti in un modo più profondo il dialogo interreligioso. Questo essenzialmente è, come dire, la teologia comparata. E padre Clooney è lo studioso che l'ha introdotta, la dobbiamo essenzialmente a lui questa disciplina. E quindi i suoi libri vertono quasi tutti su questa tematica e vi farò vedere un po' di testi, li commentiamo insieme. Ha una pagina sua web e i suoi testi vertono in gran parte sulla teologia comparata, che purtroppo non sono ancora tradotti in italiano, ma insomma io sto già attivandomi per vedere se riesco a trovare un editore che possa tradurre in italiano alcuni suoi testi. Ve li scorro velocemente, così vi fate un po' un'idea, sono tantissimi libri. Ovviamente è anche un grande esperto di dialogo interreligioso che fa non soltanto su un piano astratto, teorico, ma anche in modo molto, molto concreto. E rientra, diciamo, i suoi studi, molto specializzati nel versante dell'induismo. Si può anche considerare un grande esperto di Indo-Christian Studies, la comparazione tra induismo e cristianesimo. Come fare teologia comparata, vediamo diverse cose, e vedete, sono anche testi anche manualistici sulla teologia comparata. Io personalmente nei miei studi ho attinto molto a Theology After Vedanta, insomma, ecco. Quindi adesso lo ascoltiamo veramente molto volentieri perché è un onore averlo qui con noi e, ripeto, è un'occasione per introdurre nei nostri scenari accademici la teologia comparata, con la speranza che poi in futuro, insomma, si possa, ecco, anche noi qui in Gregoriano lavorare in questa direzione. Prego, padre.
Good evening. I would like to begin by expressing my thanks for the opportunity to be here and to speak to you this evening. I am very grateful to the Center for Interreligious Studies for hosting this event, to Dr. Ambrosio Bongiovanni and Paolo Triani for their warm welcome, and especially to Father Brian Lobo of the Missiology faculty, who went out of his way to invite me and to make me feel warm and welcome coming here tonight. And I have a word of sympathy for Mr. Lorenzo, the translator, who will try to explain anything I have to say for those wishing to have translation. I'm very sorry that I cannot speak to you in Italian, but nonetheless, that is my limitation. And also my apology to those of you who are native Tamil speakers. Monica, no, I cannot, nalla Tamil pesarada, so I cannot do it. So I will do my best in English with you tonight. There is the handout that you have that has the verses that I translated from the Tamil that will appear in the course of my lecture. So you can look at those, and those of you who are Tamil knowing, I can give you the original if you want to check the translations later and correct them as well. For a few years now, I have been translating some medieval Tamil poetry in the Vaishnava tradition of the Alvars. I've been translating the first 5 of these Tamil language saints who lived approximately in the 8th to 10th centuries in South India. Names that are not familiar to most of us, surely. Poigai Alvar, Put Alvar, Pei Alvar, Tirumurisai Paran, and Namalvar or Shatakopan, these great saints of South India, who in that time period composed among themselves about 4,000 verses of beautiful Tamil poetry that are emotional, philosophical, deep, referring to temples, to places in South India, and also have a certain power religiously in terms of knowledge of God. They were gathered into a canon of sacred texts that really was saying that the divine word, the word of God, was being expressed in human words. Expressed in human words, but also sung in human words, recited in temple rituals, and memorized by many devotees over the centuries. What I would like to do is tell you about the project, translating the poetry. I've translated maybe 600 verses from these first Alvars, and then explore with you how is this relevant to Catholic theology by asking how poetry is relevant to Catholic theology. Because only if we understand poetry and theology can we understand Hindu poetry and theology. It is very hard to translate any poetry from one language to another, and I've been trying to be attentive to the subtleties and profundity of the poetry, and doing my best to be faithful to the verses while giving them some meaning in the English language. Doubly hard for me because I am not a native Tamil speaker, and have learned only as best I can over many years now. But I'd like to show that translating poetry is a very intimate nature of a religious act of entering into the other tradition. By poetry, we go deeper into the tradition than perhaps our minds or intellects alone can bring us. Of course, before the textual approach to poetry and commentary on poetry, by way of reading poetry, there is also recitation, the singing of the Alvar's poetry, as I mentioned, in temple context as well. And much is gained by recitation, by memorization, and by the living tradition of saints such as the Alvars, a tradition even alive today in South India and many temples now in the West as well. For at issue in poetry, sung, spoken, read, are the particularity of words, the specific and intense unity of form, meaning, and word. These features can be appreciated in many different ways if we think of our reading poetry in our native language, and then all the more the challenges of taking poetry from another language into our own language. These are questions about poetry, about hearing and reading poetry, translating it, but I'd like to say ultimately, and this is what we really can talk about tonight, making it make sense theologically from a Catholic perspective. So while much of what I say may not seem to be about Catholic theology, the goal really is to bring it into the Catholic theological consciousness. And I hope to be able to explain this to you. I begin, though, somewhere else. The issues related to theology and poetry are not strange to the Catholic tradition, the Christian tradition. Here I can point to just one instance where the issues I have in mind arise, when efforts are made to generate Christian theology from the Psalms in the Bible, a beautiful set of 150 poems in beautiful Hebrew, beautifully expressed, that from the beginning, from the Gospels themselves, Christians have tried to use in terms of expressing the mission of Christ. But how do we learn from the Psalms is a good starting point. The task is not simply to read the Psalms in a way that thinks of them as theological treatises or as texts that simply give certain theological ideas, but rather to appreciate them, to appreciate their language, the way they are sung, and the way they are used in devotional context. Many an author, long before me, have written about the challenges of reading the Psalms theologically from a Christian perspective, and I will refer here just to several famous authors. One is Robert Alter. Robert Alter, in several of his books, including The Art of Biblical Poetry, has tried to express the challenges of reading Hebrew poetry and understanding it even in translation. The question about the form of poetry, he writes, is the most basic question, apart from the utility of versification for texts, in many cases that were actually sung. What difference does it make for the content of the Psalms that they are poetry? Poetry working through a system of complex linkages of sound, image, word, rhythm, syntax, theme, idea, is an instrument of conveying densely patterned meanings and sometimes contradictory meanings that are not easily conveyable in other forms of discourse. In other words, the Psalms are composed as poetry because as poetry they say things that cannot be said in prose. He goes on to say that although it is true that God exists before and beyond language, and is by no means the product or the captive of the poet's medium and mind, God manifests himself in part through language, and necessarily his deeds are known by anyone to others, as also perhaps by any man to himself, chiefly through the medium of language. And Alter claims the Psalms, more than any other body of biblical poems, bring to the fore this consciousness of the linguistic medium of religious experience. The psalmist's delight in the suppleness, the serendipities of poetic form, is not a distraction from the spiritual seriousness of the poems, but his chief means of realizing his spiritual vision. It is the power of these poems that they continue to not only excite our imaginations, but also engage our lives. I have here quotes from several other authors I'll read more briefly. Patrick Miller, a fine scholar of biblical poetry based at Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, has highlighted in a number of his writings the difficulty of capturing Hebrew poetry in English because so much is going on in the poetry. There are gaps and ellipses. Sometimes things are said very tersely. There are balancing symmetries that go back and forth between different forms of Hebrew verbs. There are contrasts and equivalences. There are clauses that seem to be almost deliberately unclear. And Miller constantly in his work points out that to understand poetry, you have to understand how the poet is thinking and how the poet is putting the words together. And to quote briefly from one of his writings, Miller, poetic discourse is thus a mode of speech that is indirect, open, and rooted in the imagination. Primal speech to God, whether lament or praise, tends to be of this form figural, non-direct, ambiguous, and imaginative, open and not closed. Such speech is therefore on that basis stylistically and theologically constructive. Another author to whom I could refer more at length, but again only briefly, Beth Tanner, again talks about the nature of Hebrew poetry, the nature of composition in the Hebrew language, and the choices that the poets of the Psalms are making in speaking of God, of the temple, of Jerusalem, of the deeds of God in poetic form. She reminds us that poetry, with its rich metaphors and word pictures, is uniquely contextual. In a sense, you have to be there to appreciate the poetry. This is bad news for modern interpreters because we're not there. We were not there in 1000 BCE. We were not there in 800 BCE when the poems were composed, and therefore have to imagine ourselves back into that context. And so much of the meaning of the words, the feel of the Hebrew, can get lost in translation. And that I think she sees as a challenge. But she insists that we are able to learn deeply and in a different way from the poetry of the Bible, particularly the Psalms. The Psalms reach places in both the brain and the heart that other genres of writing do not reach. If we can read them not only for their ideas, but for their poetry, we go deeper interreligiously as well. Now, I would add here then, before turning finally to my Tamil material, that therefore the writings of a poet require a certain kind of Christian theology. That if we simply take poetry and comment on it in prose, we lose something. That the poetry is meant to be poetic, it is meant to be read poetically, and therefore the theologian who writes about the Psalms, the Song of Songs, other parts of the poetry of the Bible, has to be aware of their own limitations of language if writing academic work or doctrinal theology, how to make the theology poetic and bring it to the fore in a poetic fashion. And I would say then that if this is the case, that although the Psalms can be used in some way to mirror the truth of Christ, and in some way to speak of the coming of Christ, the meaning of Christ, that still has to be done in a way that respects the poetry. And if that is the case from learning from the Psalms in the Bible, it is also the case when we learn from poetry of another religious tradition. My example is Hindu, Tamil Hindu, but it could also be the Arabic of the Quran, which in a certain sense is poetic, or poetry of North India, poetry of African religious traditions, poetry is East Asia, and so on, to be thinking about how poetry works in our minds, and that is something we can talk about. So what happens if we attempt to learn interreligiously from the poets of another religious tradition? What happens if we undertake the project of translating such poetry from another tradition, trying to find a way to make the poetry meaningful to ourselves and intimate to ourselves in a way that does not fail the intentions of the authors? So poets write with a great intensity, intimacy, love of what they are expressing. How do we receive that in translation and then read it in a way that is also serious, intimate, and saying something to us personally is really the theological project. And this I would like to reflect on based on the translations I have been doing in three different ways. The first way will be thematic, looking for certain themes in poetry. The second way will be how poetry gets deep inside our memory, reminding us of things that we do know or of things that we never heard before. And then thirdly, what happens when we begin to love the poetry we read? If it's of another religious tradition, where does that poetry leave us? How does that poetry speak to us? And I will illustrate this with some of the verses that are on the pages that you have before you. So I've been translating these poets from the 8th, 7th, 8th, 9th century. And the first one of them, Poigai Alvar, writes a work simply called the first set of 100 verses in a metered style where the last word of each verse is the first word of the next verse, the Andadi style. And I've been thinking about him for our examples today. So all the verses on your sheet are from this Alvar, Poigai Alvar, the Alvar of the tank, the Alvar of the pond. And I give you there some of them on the sheet that we can look at first. At the beginning of the poem, earth, the lamp's bowl, circling ocean, the melted butter, fiery sun, the flame. With this lamp, by this garland of words, I adorn the feet of the one who holds the flaming red discus. I cry, may our ocean of sorrows dry up. When did you churn the ocean? When you accepted the water offering, which world did you get? I have no idea. You, Lord, bridged the ocean, broke the bridge, slept again on the ocean. You created the earth, you uplifted it, you consumed it, and you put it forth again. In these verses, the first verses of the first of the Alvar saints, the saint who beautifully holds up images like the earth itself is the bowl of a lamp, and the ocean is like the melted butter, the sun itself is like the flame in the lamp for the arati, is putting forward a beginning of a tradition to which he himself is very much a part. The knowledge communicated in the two verses I just read are densely packed knowledge. Myths of the Lord's deeds are piled up all at once. The churning of the ocean, the using of a mountain as a churn to release the Amrita, the elixir of life, or the Lord coming as a dwarf, receiving a water offering from the great King Bali. Before the dwarf, the little man expands and becomes as large as the universe. A myth that may not be known to many of us previously, but is very well known in South India. As Rama, bridging the gap between South India and Sri Lanka in order to invade Ravana's kingdom and rescue Sita, or as breaking that bridge, or as reclining seemingly forever on the ocean of milk that surrounds the earth, or as consuming and emitting the world in the act of creating. The end of the world, the Lord consumes and eats the world. Creation is putting the world forth again. All of these deeds, the poet is saying, are powerful, they are known, but he can still ask, Lord, when did this happen? And he says in the second verse, I have no idea. Knowing of the deeds of the Lord, but not really understanding them. The one that comes up a number of times here, the dwarf is very small, referring to the idea that the dwarf comes to the king and says, give me 3 steps of earth so that I can make a sacrifice on those 3 steps of earth. And the dwarf then grows. The first step covers the earth. The second step covers the heavens. And the third step seems to come back and touch the head of the king, who then becomes a devotee of the Lord. This myth comes back again and again, where poetically spoken, that which is insignificant and small becomes cosmic in size, larger than anything else. In verse 3, this continues. One stride, the measure of the whole earth. Another, the measure of the waters surrounding the earth. And as for that demon so enchanting in form, O Lord, you got her measure too. But even now, I don't know how to measure your ways. Measuring the earth, measuring the heaven, getting the measure of this demoness who came to poison the child Krishna by breastfeeding him with poison. He knew exactly who it was and killed the demon. But Lord, I cannot measure you. All of this is flowing beautifully in the Tamil. And then there are a number of verses. I give you some more on the page, 14, 21, 50, and so on. Again and again, the poet is talking about needing to get deep into the poetry. 14. People all offer praise as best they know how, all thinking, this one, that one, is my Lord. They draw a picture of him on the wall, they install a shrine, they worship him, but the form of the one who measured the earth, his form is before them all, greater than them all. In verse 20, not given on the page, the gods themselves are seen to be worshiping the feet that had measured the universe. But the next verse, which I do give you, is an appeal that the saint himself must meditate on this dwarf, who is also cosmic in size and travels the universe. The Lord went here and there, standing here, receiving water in his lovely cupped hands, and then by 3 steps he measured the directions, that red-eyed Lord, the discus his weapon, the eagle his mount, he reclined on his serpent. So reach his feet, dear heart, deep heart, know this. Or right in the middle of the entire 100 verses, verse 50. There, again, the dwarf is referred to, growing as large as the universe. But this time the saint calls for ascetical practice and pious devotion that in combination enable the listeners actually to see the dwarf as Bali is granting the wish by pouring the water into the hands of the dwarf. And this is the verse, really again expressed to the self, to the heart of the devotee who is listening. If you master your 5 difficult senses, and come near him with flowers piously chosen, than to see him receiving the water which great King Bali, perched on his throne, poured in his hands, will be easy for you. But only if you're an ascetic. Only if you focus yourself can you really understand what poetry is about. Control the senses, worship the Lord, see him in his small form. And near the end of the poem, I give you verse 84, this now familiar act of the Lord, tiny yet cosmic in size, is still unfathomable. Lord, no one knows your greatness, how you stretched forth that day and measured the world, but even that was not as long as your boar tusk. So what's all this? O Father, the entire earth is the measure of just 1 foot of your reach. And again, it's the poet coming back again and again to the same theme, the same words. And I think part of the point is to do it 100 times over is really to be begging the reader to become part of the story and to imagine this as well. Now, on a note, to finish this first section on the theme of God small and large, God who seems to be a little dwarf, and then God as great as the universe, this theme is not that difficult for a Christian to pick up. The myth of a deity who is ever smallest and greatest, negligible but larger than the world itself, should ring true for us who are Christian. We may think of the small acts of Christ during his short time on earth that grew large, changing the world entirely. We may simply remember with St. Paul, as he says in Colossians, "For in him the fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have come to fullness in him who is the head of every ruler and creator." So for a Hindu poet to say God was very, very small and became very, very large should resonate with us who have Catholic Christian faith. It makes sense across religious boundaries. And I think also, as I would add, the vision of a small one who grows large may symbolize how we learn interreligiously. There are small clues and passing references that begin to get inside our consciousness at a much more momentous level in ways we cannot understand. A small verse here and there, such as I give you on the page, can begin to grow on you and become part of your Catholic imagination. These produce new and unfamiliar, often difficult or obscure meanings, and experiences that later on become parts of your life as you understand better what you are reading. And I think this is part of the reason that people both love and perhaps fear comparative work. That when you start to take seriously and learn from the stories of another religious tradition, you may find that you learn to love them, that you learn to appreciate them, they're in your mind. When you read the Psalms, you think of Hindu poetry or Chinese poetry or African poetry, whatever. These things get inside you and they become part of how you think. And that, I think, personally is a good thing. But I can see that some people might say, I don't want that inside my head. I want to keep it out there somewhere instead. And that is something we can talk about. So that was my first point, really the thematic point. The second point is on this point of memory. Remembering things that we either did know before or remembering things that we never knew before but become part of our memory. A particular angle of poetry that in the succinctness of tightly written verses, much is communicated by allusions rather than by full exposition. So earlier I quoted from Alter and Miller and Tanner, how the poems always are very brief and never say everything. And they assume that you know the story of Genesis, you know the story of Exodus, you know what happened to the people of Israel. And poetry is always doing this, reminding you incompletely of the great events of the past. It presumes that the reader knows information about the past and is simply being reminded of it. Small fragments of reference that stand in for great narratives and momentous encounters with God. Poetry must say less than it means, if it's good poetry. It asks the reader to fill in the gaps, adding or re-adding what the poet has omitted. Poetry needs and provokes acts of memory, and in doing so, it also teaches new generations new memories. To illustrate this, return for a moment to the Psalms. I give you, I think, at the top of the first page, a verse from Psalm 78. And as you know, Psalm 78 is one of the longest psalms in the the Bible, and over many verses, 70 verses or more, recounts all the deeds of God for the people, giving you only little bits of knowledge about them, assuming you know these stories. I'm reminding you, and it begins with these very beautiful words. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their children. We will tell the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders he has done. And Psalm 78 works not because it tells you everything that is in the Bible up to Psalm 78, but because it's awakening memories in the people, to the listeners, and saying, remember the stories of the past. And many a theologian has written about the importance of memory, remembering the stories of God, remembering what has happened, God in the world, God in Jesus Christ. And in a sense, the psalmist is just saying, our duty is to remember and pass it down. That is what we do as believers. And so with this in mind, returning to my saint, Poigai Alvar, and his verses recollecting the story of the dwarf and a host of other stories, all these details would have been known to Hindus hearing the poetry even for the first time. They would have known the story of the dwarf that grew large, or of Rama crossing over from South India to Sri Lanka, and so on. These stories were well-known stories. Certainly today, members of the Sri Vaishnava Hindu community also recognize these stories, even when they're given in very partial form. They don't need to be told who these figures are. They remember them very well. The unfamiliar becomes familiar when children learn the stories from their parents and grandparents and so on. That's how the tradition lives and passed down. But it's interesting then to think of how this poetry begins to give memories to those of us who did not grow up in that tradition. So not even like the Psalms, which remind us of the history of the people of Israel, poetry from elsewhere in the world, beginning to have knowledge in our lives that we did not have before. In some ways, we are like visitors to South India, in this case, or like archaeologists finding fragments of things from long ago, or going around the city, even here, finding fragments of things that remind us of what happened 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. The poetry is full of things that provoke our memories, passed down from generation to generation. What happens when you and I hear enough about the dwarf or Rama or Krishna or the milk ocean, and suddenly these things begin to stick in your memory, even though before you walked in the room, you knew nothing about them? How does that remembering work? I give you a set there of 5 verses, 13 through 17, to give an example of how the poet is reminding people again and again how this works. I'll just read the last 3 of the verses to save a little time. The 3 gods are first, but among those 3, first is the one whose color is that of the deep sea. Apart from the grace of that first good one, the grace of everyone else in the world surrounded by waters is sheer waste. Sheer waste, so many days have passed, I feared, and so I wept. And then I saw him sleeping on the serpent bed. I worshipped his feet, which the roaring sea touches. Fiery red are his eyes, the color of the raging sea. His feet crossed the earth, his arms spread wide in every direction. His topknot touched the world above, so they say. And with his sharp claws he tore open Hiranya's chest. He rode the eagle with broad wings, and once he measured the earth. Like the psalmist recounting the deeds of the Lord, the poet is recounting the deeds of Lord Vishnu. But such verses remind us, who did not grow up in South India, or anywhere in India, of things that we did not know about in the first place. At first, we simply do not know what's going on. We cannot merely by recitation and repetition move from poetic clues to the whole narratives of divine action. The references, at first obscure, give us the feeling that we are suddenly listening in on a conversation to which we do not belong. And I will leave that point for our conversation, but I hope you see what I mean, is that when we begin to learn interreligiously, all kinds of ideas and persons and stories, images get inside our imagination alongside those of the Bible and the Catholic tradition. It's not simply the other religion is out there somewhere and we look at it out there, but the memories become our memories too. And in our memory, we have to begin to sort out, how do I remember this? How do I remember that? How do I get these pieces to fit together? And I think that is a deeper way of beginning to understand than simply knowing a story or a theme that is given to us. My third point, and then I just have a brief conclusion. My third point is about how this takes a long time. I have drawn no important conclusions thus far. I have intended no great contribution to the theology of religions, even if I think the implications of what I'm saying can have great meaning missiologically. But neither has my lecture been simply about translating Tamil poetry. So you can ask, how is my work Catholic? How is it theological? Let me try to explain on a third level. On the methodological side, my point is that a close reading of religious poetry from a variety of angles is a good and proper form of theology. So much theology in the Catholic tradition is by way of commentary. Not everyone was writing systematic treatises. Not everyone was doing apologetics. Not everyone was putting forward theories. Many a commentator, including great figures like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, all the way back to the early church, were commenting on holy texts. And the theology was opened up little by commentary, inviting the reader to read, simply than saying it means this, it means this, it means this. No, it's by way of commentary. So if we learn from the poetry of another religion, something similar is going on. God is in the details. God is in the specific realities of other religious traditions. God is in the poetry. Just as the particularity of our own faith has to be appreciated and defended. Poetry shows a stellar example of the necessary concreteness that must be worked through and not merely generalized. In principle, other kinds of ideas and words, images and practice also invite intense attention. If you visit a country you've never been to and visit its holy places, then suddenly you begin to see things that change the way you learn, change what you know. You think of how other people worship, how other people sing, what they do at birth, what they do at death, and so on. All of this begins to mean something, but only little by little by little, not all at once. What is the theological takeaway from my saying things like that it's a slow learning process? I think it means that we have to learn other religious traditions the way we learn our own. We say, following St. John, the Word was made flesh. The Word dwelt among us. At the same time, we believe that the Word took flesh in human words. The words of the Gospels are not apart from God's Word. In some way, human words are God's words. So we can ask, are the words of these Alvars, these Hindu saints, are they sacred words? And I think that is answered not in abstraction, closing one's eyes and saying, do other religions have sacred texts? But rather by saying, Poi Gai Alvar, who I've been reading to you, is there something sacred or holy in this poetry? I think that's a better question to ask, but it takes a lot longer. So we have to be able to think it through by studying the poetry carefully. Consider one more example. So I've been treating Poi Gai Alvar's verses, and I selected on the basis of a theme verses like 1 and 2 and 3, 14, 21, 50, 84, and so on. I've been quoting different verses to you. But what happens if you read any given verse in its context of the verses around them instead of skipping? So for instance, I gave you verse 50 in the context of verses before and after it. So verse 50 again, which I read to you. If you master your 5 difficult senses and come near him with flowers piously chosen, then to see him receiving the water with great King Bali, perched on his throne, poured into his delicate hands, that will be easy. So that's the verse. But reading it by itself is unfair. Why? Because the poet deliberately put it as verse 50 with 49 verses before it and approximately, 49 or 50 after it. So how do you read it in context? And I give you there verses 48 to 52 to see this, and to save time, I'll just read verses 49, again 50 and 51 to show how it begins to open up. So verse 49, which is on your page, they winnow down their many bodies as if to a single ape flower seed, a tiny, tiny seed, the mahil seed, to just one body, as they strive to see our primal Lord, whose tall topknot and bright crown are radiant like fresh, bright flowers. But all the others seeking him find him difficult to reach. If you master your 5 difficult senses and come near him with flowers piously chosen, then to see him receiving the water with great King Bali perched on his throne poured into his sacred, delicate hands will be easy. And now the verse after it, very mysterious, a verse that continues the theme of the easy. That I might see his feet easily, my heart became clear as he became completely clear to me. Whatever it means, it's very beautiful. My heart became clear as he became completely clear to me. To battle the demons soiled by pride, my Lord became a lion. So please, just count up his names. And I hope you see from this that it becomes a little bit more complicated every time I read another verse, because what are these verses individually talking about? And then when you read them together, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, and on, how do you begin to learn with that so much poetry all at once? It takes time. It is not an easy thing to do. These verses and all the verses before and after in Poigai Alvar's work are held together in a style that means you should read them together. The last word or sound of each verse is the first of the next. So they're meant to be taken together. 48 speaks of battle, 49 and 50 ascetical practices and vision of God. 51 describes a seeing that then is terrifying, as the beautiful Lord turns out to be a ferocious man-lion who comes in the form of a man-lion and tears the demon apart. A famous scene, Narasimha comes as that lion. And 52 offers a vision of the gods who worship the Lord eternally. It takes some time to appreciate the sequence of 5 verses and to learn from the accumulation of idea, insect, and affect. My larger point then in giving these verses is to invite the reader, me first because I've been trying to translate, but then you as you begin to read this page that I gave you, invites us to ponder how and why to read them in the order given. But this is very hard to do, even with just 5 verses. So what would happen if we took up all 100 verses of Poigai Alvar and said, we'll read them together before we ask, are they holy or not? Are they sacred or not? Are they revelation or not? Can Christians learn from them or not? Before asking those big questions, can we learn what we're talking about by actually reading the poetry? And I think we have to read the poetry, hear the poetry, sing the poetry, something, before we start talking about it. Or why those 100 verses? How about the 300 verses of the first 3 of the Alvar saints? Or the 600 verses that I'm translating in my project? Or the 4,000 verses of the 12 saints taken together? It gets bigger and bigger, and then in another lecture, not this lecture, I could talk about the thousands of pages of commentary on these verses by ancient and modern commentators in the Hindu tradition. It gets very large. And I think what this means for me is that we get caught up in a learning process not easily finished by anyone's well-planned schedule. That is to say, we have to engage in open-ended learning and can't impatiently rush and say, this is what Hindu poetry means for Catholic theology. We have to be able to say, wait, I'm not there yet. I have to understand the poetry before I start making judgments about it. To conclude, I have proposed a variety of perspectives on learning from poetry. First, the Psalms in the Christian and biblical tradition, but also outside it by reading Hindu poetry. The example of learning from the Psalms showed me a way to think about how to learn from the Hindu saints as well. I have been urging us to be more conscious and deliberate in learning from poetry. Poetry is in the plural, because in its difficult concreteness, poetry enables us to learn imaginatively, without getting immediately bogged down in theoretical issues that block the learning and lead to no good results. Theology is not ruled out. Systematic theology is not ruled out. Doctrinal theology is not ruled out. Dogmatic theology is not ruled out. But they don't come first. Rather, first comes disciplined and enriched learning in a variety of ways, including by way of the ancient tradition of commentary, by allowing the concreteness of poetic images to come to the fore, to touch us, to become part of our memories, and to grow up within us. But this takes time. It is worth waiting for the slow learning to ripen and mature. The theology arising from a deep learning of the poetry of another religious tradition will gradually become deeply ingrained in the realities of that faith tradition, such poetries as I have shown here. Now, do we have the time? My last paragraph. Can we wait out this process of the maturing of a double culture, double civilization, faith traditions amidst language and literature, art and ritual? Do we have time in our studies, do we have time in our teaching to take the time to learn deeply instead of rushing to conclusions? I don't know if we have the time, but I think we need to take the time. And I think this case should hardly need to be made here in Rome, the eternal city of all places. For a very long time, from the beginnings of Rome through the Renaissance, the beginnings of the church through the Renaissance in modern times, the church has always been imbibing classical languages, literatures, cultures of Rome and Greece, making the literature, pagan or not, poetry or not, art or not, part of Catholic imagination. Even the faith of innumerable Catholic Christians. The process took a very long time. I notice on the seal of the Gregorianum University, Religione et Bonis Artibus. And so religion and the fine arts, that all of this goes together. You can't just say religion but not the fine arts, or my religion but not the fine arts. But religion and the arts go together. And if that is true here in Rome and for the Gregorian University, how can we say that the poetries of other religious traditions, other great literatures of the world, should be treated hastily or with less respect? And I will stop there. Thank you very much.